And the second is to correct what Victoria was saying to you before about hot dogs not being a sandwich. A subcategory of the sandwich is a submarine sandwich, and a submarine is a split bun with meat and toppings inside of it, which also describes a hot dog. So, putting all of that to rest now. And I know that because I've shared with you before that at dinners, we'll often ask questions to get conversations going, sometimes to start debates, and to learn a little bit more about one another. And one of the forms of questions that's been asked a lot lately is, would you rather? And in these, you're given 2, 3, 4 more options and asked to choose which you would rather do or have or want. Some are funny or outlandish, others are serious and thought-provoking. Would you rather only be able to drink pop, juice, milk, or water for the rest of your life? Would you rather only be able to eat chocolate or candy or chips for the rest of your life? Would you rather live in a cabin in the woods, a condo in the city, or a cottage by the beach? Would you rather live without movies, TV, or music for the rest of your life? And one that I've heard a number of times and came to mind this week, one that in our social media world where we can have hundreds of followers, of friends, but still feel completely alone is this. Would you rather have a lot of friends or acquaintances or just a few best friends? Now, I can tell you that one answer immediately jumps out for me, but I'm sure other people would see value in the opposite. And so I did a little bit of research about this question, and it seems that even the experts can't agree on which one is better. Some saying more friends is the best option, or more acquaintances is the best option because it reduces the feelings of loneliness that we have. A larger group of people that can be there to support us when we need it, and a more diverse group to advise us when we're going through things. While others would say fewer close friendships is the best way to go because they go deeper. They allow us the opportunity to grow as people and to grow together, and they develop a greater sense of self-worth for the people within them. And for me, it was in thinking about this last definition that I was drawn to the main characters of the story we're going to be looking at for our subject this week. The friend being perhaps one of the greatest of all the heroes. The man after God's own heart, the psalmist, the giant slayer, the boy who killed a bear and a lion in protecting his sheep, the king whose line the Messiah would be born from, David. I think most often when we think of heroes in this story, it's him that steps out into the spotlight. But the man who would become his best friend, the one he would make a pact with, was no slouch as we look at him. That there's a great deal we can learn from Jonathan about him and about ourselves as we take a deeper look at his life this morning in our Heroes of the Bible series. Jonathan, who we hear about first in our passage this morning from 1 Samuel chapter 18, described in this way. And it says, after David had finished talking with Saul, Jonathan became one in spirit with David, and he loved him as himself. Now, this wording of two becoming one is mentioned several other times throughout the Bible. But outside of this one instance, it was used to describe either a believer's relationship with God or the relationship of two people being joined in marriage. This is wording that describes the deepest, most intense, most intimate relationships that someone can have. And we read it here as the way that David and Jonathan saw and experienced their friendship with one another. But as we delve a little more into Jonathan's story, we see that there is a reason for this deep connection. Because really, Jonathan was David before David came along. And I'll explain, because if we turn back to 1 Samuel chapter 13, where Jonathan is first introduced to us, we see that he is a skilled warrior, just like David. Twice taking on the Philistines with little or no help and winning battles. The first is just a passing reference in 1 Samuel chapter 13. But in 1 Samuel 14, we have a more in-depth telling. This moment in time where Jonathan sneaks off away from his father Saul's army, taking only his armor bearer with him. They cross a canyon, climb a mountain towards a Philistine outpost. They hear the magic words that Jonathan says that they will hear, "Come to us," and they go up and defeat the 25 men who find themselves in that space. Following this, the Israelites, who are kind of back on their heels and worried and scattering away, start to rally. The Philistines start attacking each other, and Israel wins a great victory. Jonathan, like David later on, becomes a hero to the other soldiers, a great leader in their eyes, so much so that even though he sins against God, by breaking a vow that his father had made that no one would eat anything before sundown. Perhaps that questionable self-control that David also displays later. The men stand up for him, preventing Saul from killing his son. Jonathan seemed to be destined for amazing things because of his fighting background, his leadership abilities, and the fact that in the eyes of the people, he was second in line to the throne. He was the oldest son of the king. It was perceived to be his birthright to succeed his father Saul as king of their people. Jonathan was so much of what David was and seemed destined for the life that ultimately David would have. And just as everything changed for David after his decisions around Bathsheba and Uriah, everything would change for Jonathan after the events of that day and the breaking of the vow. Because it wouldn't be his crown to wear. He wouldn't sit on the throne. He would not be the one receiving all the praise and adulation of the people later in life. It was David, the best friend, the one he'd sworn an oath with in our passage, who would be the one that would receive those things. So if David ultimately becomes the big hero, the one everyone remembers, what can we learn about Jonathan other than that he was a lesser version of his friend and self-control did him in? The first thing is that Jonathan acted out of a deep, unselfish love in his relationship with David. We read multiple times in our passage that Jonathan loved David as himself. And chapter 19 tells us that Jonathan had taken a great liking to David. This was more than just a feeling. It was treating David with the same level of respect and care and concern he would expect for himself. It meant being willing to risk things, everything for this person, putting his interests and well-being above Jonathan's own, as we will hear in a little bit. Jonathan displayed an unselfish, unconditional love for someone else. And we see the first signs of the evidence of the depths of this love for him in the actions of verse 4. And it says, Jonathan took off the robe he was wearing and gave it to David, along with his tunic, his sword, his bow, and his belt. Now, this was more than just an act of generosity. It was a sign to David of how much Jonathan valued him, his worth in the eyes of his friend. This was Jonathan showing him in those moments that he was willing to give up everything for his friend. Jonathan foreshadowing in these moments another act of deep, unselfish love that would come later in the Bible. An unselfish love that only grew from there. Because as we continue to read their story unfold in 1 Samuel chapters 19 and 20, Jonathan would be asked to demonstrate that love time and time and time again. Because while Jonathan deeply loved David, his father Saul did not. And Jonathan's loyalty would be put to the test. Because as David's legend grew, on multiple occasions, Saul tried unsuccessfully to kill David, to remove him for the picture in order to keep the crown, or perhaps to be able to pass it on to one of his heirs to take over. And while he would often try these things on his own, there were also times where he attempted to use Jonathan, to take advantage of his closeness to David, to be the one to accomplish his goals. Chapters 19 and 20 tell of times where Jonathan stood in front of his father and openly defied him, speaking on David's behalf, hiding David away from his father's eyes, warning him when things were getting too serious, helping him flee when there was no other option. Jonathan even chose to put his own life on the line as his father began to mistrust and to attack him, once throwing a spear at him during a dinner that we read about in chapter 20. Jonathan's deep, unselfish love for David lived out in his loyalty to his friend and his devotion to their covenant with one another. But lived out as well, I believe, in the second and most important lesson that we can learn from him today. Jonathan was so filled with the deep, unselfish love of God that he was willing to fully submit to God's will for his life. Jonathan, we need to remember, at that time, at least from an earthly perspective, was the one in that relationship with everything to lose. He was the heir to the throne. He was the military leader with his father. He could have sided with his dad, with the king. He could have taken advantage of their relationship for his own personal gain. But as 1 Samuel tells us in chapters 20 and 23, that as Jonathan becomes aware of the fact that David is the one that God desires to lead his people, Jonathan chooses to lay down his claim to the throne, just as he'd offered up the items that represented it to David in our passage this morning. He chooses in those moments to fully submit to the will of God. Now, Jonathan, I'm sure, had dreams. He most likely had envisioned himself as the king. There probably were moments when his father wasn't around that he tried on the crown to see how it would feel, or sat in his father's seat, practiced perhaps how he would address the military before leading them out into battle, or what it would feel like to hear the cheers of the crowd when they came back in victory. But Jonathan willingly laid all of those things down, pushed aside his own wants, dreams, and desires in order for God's will to be lived out with this people. He didn't stick around to divide the kingdom. He didn't try to force his way on the throne. Jonathan submitted to the will of God, gave up his future kingdom, and bowed out of the picture in order for David to become the man and king that God created him to be. Jonathan, from a strictly human, not Jesus perspective, makes perhaps the greatest personal sacrifice that we'll read about in the Bible. Again, foreshadowing the man who would lay it all down for his friends, for his enemies, for you and I, Jesus, all those centuries later. Jonathan was a hero in the story of the Bible because of what he gave up, not what he took in. What he sacrificed more than what he gained, because I think many of us wouldn't know the first part of his story. He's a hero not because of the king he was, but the king he wasn't. A hero because of the love he had for his friend, and how he demonstrated that love for him and for the God they both faithfully served through his acts of submission to his will. A love for God and a love for others that, friends, we are challenged in Jonathan's story to try to emulate. But one we're called in the teachings of Jesus to model if we're going to be his followers as well. We read in Matthew 22:37-39, when in response to a question about the greatest commandment, Jesus replied, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. And the second is like it, love your neighbor as yourself. All the law and the prophets hang on these two commandments." That we are to have that same deep love that Jonathan demonstrated in his relationship with David in our relationships as well, with the people in our family, our friends, the people here in this church family, the people who make it easy to love them, those who are like us. but the people who don't make it easy to love them as well. Because Jesus also commands us to love our enemies. That this deep love for others is not just limited to the people we want to love, but it needs to be freely given and offered to all people. We are called to have a deep, unselfish love as followers of Jesus. As he put it in John 15:12-14, my command is this: love each other as I have loved you. Greater love has no one than this, to lay down one's life for one's friends. You are my friends if you do what I command. That to live a deep, unselfish love, we need to offer our best to each other. Give from a lot or a little to those in need. To use our privilege or our power or our position, not for our own gain and glory, but in service to others so that they might be uplifted. To not sit back and watch or get out our phones and record as many in our world do, but to be willing to stand up for those who are unable to stand up for themselves. To be a voice for the voiceless. To be willing to do whatever it takes to see God's love spread, his light shine in the darkest places of the world. And we're called by Jesus to a deep love that will require us to submit to the will of God. To be willing today and every day to lay down what we want. What we thought life would be like, where we thought we would end up. The job we thought we had, the relationship we thought we'd be a part of, the retirement we thought we'd enjoy, the positions we've earned, the dreams for our kids that we thought they would accomplish, the place we thought we'd live, the things we expected to be doing. That as followers of Jesus, we need to be willing to lay those things down at his feet, offering them over to him to determine what comes next. Trusting that whatever that sacrifice you're required to make is, that it will be a blessing in the lives of others and you will be blessed in giving it over to him. That it won't be easy. That there will be moments of doubt, as I'm sure Jonathan experienced as well. That there will be challenges and obstacles, moments where it all seems too much or not worth it in the end. That it will seem strange and perhaps even stupid to the people around us who don't understand what we're doing or why. And at times it might feel that way for us as well. I've probably shared this story, but I remember experiencing this in the office of my boss at Scotiabank as I went in to tell her that I was leaving to go to become a Salvation Army officer. And as I laid out what I was doing, she looked at me shocked and asked, "Well, what will you make?" And I said, "I don't know." "Where will you live?" "I'm not sure." "Why are you doing this?" "I don't really know. But I do know that God has called me to it." I learned in that moment, I've had to remind myself and been reminded by God many times since. What I believe Jonathan demonstrates in his story to us. That when we live our lives and in our relationships, whether a lot of them are just a few, with a deep, unselfish love for and from God, when we willingly submit ourselves to his plans for our lives, God's blessings will flow from generation to generation to generation. And his plans will always lead us in this life or the next to victory for him.